You know this story. You have seen the photographs. Germany, 1923. Money hauled in wheelbarrows. Banknotes stacked into toy castles by children. A nation burning its own cash for heat because the paper burned longer than the firewood it could buy. The story comes with a moral attached, and the moral is chaos. Nobody was steering, and waiting at the end of it, we are told, stands Hitler. The photographs are real. The moral attached to them is where the record starts to disagree. The printing presses had an operator. He had a name, an office, and a salary. His government could not legally fire him. He gave interviews. He stood in front of Germany's Central Bank Council in August of 1923 with the currency dying in the streets outside, and he read out his production numbers like a proud factory manager. Paper mills, printing firms, 2,000 presses running day and night. He was not hiding what he was doing. He believed it was his duty. Let me say that again because it's the whole video. The man printing the money thought he was saving Germany. I'm going to show you who he was, what he believed, who actually won from the collapse he presided over, and why the famous last line of this story, the one about Hitler, is backwards in a way that should genuinely bother you. His name was Rudolf von Havenstein. Start where the record starts. Summer, 1914. The week the First World War begins, Germany does something almost invisible. It cuts the link between the mark and gold. Before that week, 4 marks and 20 Pfennig bought you $1 American and had for decades. The number matters. Hold on to it. It comes back at the end of this story in a way nobody in 1914 could have imagined. Germany planned to pay for the war the way a gambler plans to pay for his evening. Later, out of the winnings. Instead of raising taxes, Berlin borrowed from its own citizens through war bonds and printed what borrowing could not cover. By the armistice in 1918, the government's debt had grown 20-fold. The mark had already lost close to half its value against the dollar. That was the respectable phase. A country that loses a war on credit can tax its people, cut its spending, restructure the debt, or default outright. All 4 are visible. All 4 have a bill attached with someone's name on it. Germany drifted toward a 5th option, the invisible one. The invisible option is what this video is about. Now, Versailles. You have heard the number, 132 billion gold marks in reparations, announced in May of 1921. It shows up in every textbook as the crushing, impossible bill that broke Germany. The historian Sally Marks went through the actual schedule in the 1970s, and the actual schedule tells a stranger story. The 132 billion was split into classes of bonds. The largest class, 82 billion of it, was, in her reading, never seriously expected to be collected. It existed so that politicians in Paris and London could read a big number to their voters. The bill Germany was genuinely expected to service was around 50 billion gold marks, and what it actually paid over 13 years came to less than 21 billion. But notice the phrase I keep using, gold marks. That is the detail the whole disaster turns on. Reparations were owed in gold, foreign currency, and physical goods valued in gold, coal above all, things Germany could not print. Its domestic war debt, the money it owed its own citizens, was owed in paper marks, which it could print, any amount, any time. 2 kinds of debt, one hard, one soft. Keep the distinction in your pocket because every decision Germany's central bank made from here on only makes sense once you see it. And the man making those decisions had been in his chair since 1908. Rudolf von Havenstein was not a gambler, and that is what makes him frightening. Born in Prussia in 1857, trained as a lawyer, a judge, then a finance ministry official, then president of the Prussian State Bank, and from 1908, president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank. Every account from the period paints the same picture. Diligent, honest in the personal sense, a rule follower of the old Prussian school, running Germany's printing presses on the theory that he was performing a public service. Here is what he believed, and I want to be fair to it, because it sounded reasonable to serious people at the time. Havenstein held that the mark's collapse was caused by the balance of payments, by reparations and imports draining Germany, and that the Reichsbank's note printing was merely a response to that collapse. Prices rise, so business needs more cash to function, so the bank supplies it. In his doctrine, credit that finances real production cannot cause inflation. The printing was not the fire. The printing was the fire brigade. The doctrine has a flaw you can see from your chair. If rising prices justify printing and printing raises prices, the loop has no break in it anywhere. And Havenstein already held a life appointment. That was how the Reichsbank had been built since the 1870s. What changed in May of 1922 was the last lever above him. A new law, passed under Allied pressure to free the central bank from political control, stripped the government of its power to direct the Reichsbank. The insulation was meant to protect Germany's money from politicians. What it also protected, in the event, was a doctrine with no stopping rule in it. Restate the position, because the ground is about to move. A wounded state, with soft debt at home and hard debt abroad. A central banker who believes printing is a duty, and almost no practical way to stop him. Through 1921, the mark slid, 90 to the dollar. Unpleasant, survivable. Then in June 1922, right-wing assassins murdered Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister, and his murder put a bullet through what confidence in the Republic remained. By December, the dollar cost more than 7,000 marks. Somewhere past that line, a currency crosses from inflation into something with different physics. Hyperinflation is a change of state, the way water becoming steam is a change of state. Prices stop being information. Money stops being a place to keep anything. And the state's tax system, this is the mechanism almost nobody mentions, quietly dies. Taxes are assessed on one date and paid on a later one, and by the payment date, the money is worth a fraction of the assessment. So real revenue collapses, so the deficit widens, so the presses run harder to cover it. The fire brigade is now visibly pumping fuel. I said I would be fair to Havenstein, so here is the fairness. By late 1922, he was trapped in a machine partly of his own design, where every exit looked like national suicide. Stop the discounting, and the government misses payroll for civil servants, pensioners, the army. He kept the presses running and defended the choice in public. The British ambassador in Berlin, Lord D'Abernon, watched the operation with a kind of horrified fascination and wrote in his diary that it would require handcuffs to stay the hand which turns the crank of the printing press. And in the summer of 1922, he recorded something that deserves to be more famous than the wheelbarrows. The printers went on strike. The presses stopped. The one force in Germany that could halt the money machine turned out to be organized labor asking for a raise. And Havenstein, D'Abernon wrote, brought in strikebreakers in order to get the presses going again. Sit with that. Offered a pause by Providence, the central banker of Germany broke a strike to keep printing. Then France invaded, and the machine went to full throttle. January 1923. French and Belgian troops occupy the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, to seize coal in place of missed reparations deliveries. Berlin's answer is passive resistance. The workers of the Ruhr strike en masse, and the government pays their wages. With what? You already know with what. This is the year the photographs come from, so let me put dates and receipts under the photographs. Workers in many trades were paid twice a day, morning and afternoon, with a break to shop in between, because by evening the morning wage would have rotted. That one was standard practice, not folklore, and it tells you everything about what money had become, a perishable good like fish. The wheelbarrow stories, I have to be honest with you, are harder to pin down. Tales of thieves dumping the cash and stealing the barrow circulated at the time, and they were plausible. But I could not find one documented incident with a name and a date attached anywhere in the sources this film is built from. I am telling you that openly because this channel's whole bet is that the documented version of this story is stranger than the folklore. Here is documented. By February 1924, the Reichsbank had issued a banknote for 100 trillion marks, the highest denomination it ever printed. By the time it appeared, the fever had technically broken. Under the new conversion, all those zeros came to 100 of the new Rentenmarks. Towns printed their own emergency money on silk, on leather, on playing cards. And by the 2nd of December, a single egg cost 320 billion marks. And even this, for the record, was not history's worst hyperinflation. At its peak, German prices doubled roughly every 4 days. Hungary in 1946 would later manage it every 15 hours, and Zimbabwe in 2008 came close behind. Weimar is the one the world remembers because it happened to a great industrial nation on camera. And where, in all this, is our central banker? Not in hiding, at a podium. August 1923, Havenstein reports to the Reichsbank's Governing Council on the state of his operation, and the numbers he gives are production numbers, delivered with what every account describes as something close to pride. The bank is issuing 20 trillion new marks a day. Within a week, capacity will reach 46 trillion. Behind those two numbers stood an entire industry of paper mills and printing works, running for the Reichsbank around the clock. He presented those numbers as evidence that the bank was meeting its obligation. In his mind, the great danger was that Germany might run out of cash, and he reported with visible satisfaction that it would not, because he had industrialized the solution. Remember the strike breakers of the summer before? A year on, nothing had changed but the number of zeros. The man had not wavered once. So here is where I stop narrating a disaster and start reading a ledger. Because the second thing everyone gets wrong about Weimar is the idea that everyone lost. Inflation does not destroy wealth evenly. It moves wealth from people who hold promises to people who hold things. Paper claims, savings accounts, war bonds, pensions, insurance policies were burned down to fractions of themselves. The families who held them, disproportionately the careful, saving middle class, were expropriated about as thoroughly as if the state had passed a confiscation law. Not uniformly. A fire this size jumps some houses and takes others whole, but the direction of the transfer was unmistakable. Now, the other column. Anyone who owed paper marks watched their debts evaporate. Industrialists who had borrowed to build factories kept the factories and repaid the loans with confetti. Owners of land, machines, foreign currency, things that were real, often came through intact and sometimes enriched. Farmers fed their mortgage to the fire and kept the farm. And one of the largest debtors in paper marks, and so one of the transfer's great beneficiaries, was the German state itself. The war debt it owed its own citizens, the patriotic bonds bought by school teachers and widows through 4 years of war, ran on the order of 150 billion marks. By November 1923, that entire mountain of obligation had been inflated to almost nothing. The state had defaulted on its people in everything but name, while never missing a payment. Economic historians who study this period, Gerald Feldman's The Great Disorder is the standard account, describe it exactly this way, as a gigantic, unlegislated transfer. I want to be careful here. No document proves anyone designed the inflation for this purpose. But when you ask why the men who could have stopped it were so slow to act, it is worth knowing that the state operating the presses was also the machine's biggest single winner. Because here is the last twist of the mechanism. When Germany finally chose to stop the inflation, it stopped in weeks. The ground shifted first. That autumn, the government called off passive resistance in the Ruhr, the single largest drain on its budget, and began cutting spending toward balance. Then comes November 1923, one of the strangest months in modern history. So let me give it to you dated. November 8th and 9th, a failed politician named Adolf Hitler tries to overthrow the government from a Munich beer hall and is arrested. Hold that thought. We are coming back to him. November 12th, an outside commissioner, Hjalmar Schacht, takes office, and the Reichsbank is barred from discounting new government treasury bills. In plain language, the state's credit card is cut up. No single hand threw a switch. Political retreat, fiscal repair, and a hard stop on deficit printing arrived together, and together they smothered the fire. November 15th, the new currency arrives, the Rentenmark, and it is one of history's great confidence devices. It was nominally backed by mortgages on German land, which sounds solid until you ask how a note holder would foreclose on a field. The backing was not redeemability in any practical sense. What was real was a hard cap on how many could be issued, and the visible end of deficit printing behind it. People wanted to believe, and the arithmetic finally let them believe. The design was not even Schacht's. The plan came from Finance Minister Hans Luther, building on a scheme by Karl Helfferich. Schacht's genius was enforcement and, later, self-promotion. 1 trillion old paper marks bought 1 Rentenmark. Germans did the exchange, mostly without riots, and prices simply stopped. Contemporaries called it the miracle of the Rentenmark. What the record shows is smaller and harder. A government that finally chose retreat, austerity, and a closed cash window all at once and paid the political price of all three. Which brings us to the 20th of November, 1923, and the strangest single day in this story. On that day, the Reichsbank fixed the old mark's final exchange rate, 4.2 trillion to the dollar. The number was not found by the market, it was chosen. Remember 1914? 4 marks 20 to the dollar. Schacht's stabilizers picked 4.2 trillion so that the old parity would reappear if you simply struck out 12 zeros. The whole catastrophe was, on paper, folded into a rounding exercise. 9 years of national trauma dismissed with a stroke of decimal hygiene. And on that same day, in Berlin, Rudolf von Havenstein died of a heart attack at 66, still in office. The fix had been built around him, through a parallel commissioner rather than through him. He died the day his currency was formally laid to rest. The often repeated version says he died when the Rentenmark launched. He did not. He died 5 days later, on the day the old mark's number stopped moving forever. Within weeks, Schacht had his job. Within a year, Germany had a gold-backed successor currency and an American-brokered reparations schedule. And the expropriated savers eventually got compensation of a kind. An emergency decree in 1924 revalued mortgage debt at 15% of its old gold value. A fuller law the following year raised that to 25%. Government bondholders got less, in some cases far less. The state's default was ratified at pennies on the mark by statute in peacetime. Which leaves the moral of the story. Weimar hyperinflation gave us Hitler. It is repeated so often it feels like arithmetic. Here is the record. Hitler's coup attempt happened during the hyperinflation in its very last week, and it failed. In May of 1924, with his party banned, a Nazi-aligned alliance took 6.5% of the national vote. By the December election, that share had fallen to 3%. The refounded party itself managed 2.6% in 1928, its worst result ever. 5 years after the inflation ended, Nazism was a punchline. The breakout came in 1930, and what stood behind it was the opposite disaster. A deflationary depression run by a chancellor, Heinrich Brüning, who cut spending into the collapse, with unemployment climbing past 30% by 1932. The economic historian Grégory Gallifrey-Villac tested the straight line directly, comparing later Nazi votes with local exposure to the 1923 inflation, and found no connection. A second study, published with colleagues in the Journal of Economic History in 2021, found the fingerprint that does exist. The places squeezed hardest by that austerity gave the Nazis more of their votes. Austerity was a contributor, those authors are careful to say, and not the whole story. The honest chain is longer and sadder. The inflation trauma taught German policymakers one lesson: never again. And they obeyed it a decade later by refusing to loosen anything as the Depression deepened. The wheelbarrows did not elect Hitler. The fear of the wheelbarrows, applied at exactly the wrong moment, did its part. I should say that some historians still argue for a more continuous line from 23 to 33. The debate is real. But the straight arrow you were taught does not survive the election returns. So when the word Weimar gets thrown at every modern central bank that prints money, here is the structure worth carrying out of this video. Germany's disaster ran on two engines at once: hard obligations abroad, in gold and goods it could not print, and unlimited deficit finance at home through a central bank that had stopped saying no. A country borrowing in its own currency lacks the first engine. It is not immune to the second. The comparison earns its keep about once a century. The Panic Papers is me, reading the receipts so you can check them. Sources for every number are in the description. If your family carried a story out of 1923, a note kept in a drawer, a grandmother who counted zeros, I would genuinely like to read it. The comments are there. And if the record beating the legend is your kind of story, the gold window closed on live television in 1971, and that one is already on the channel. See you in the next file.